Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be discussing 4 feminine archetypes: the Queen, the Mother, the Wise Woman, and the Beloved. Alright, so in this week's video, we're going to be talking about the feminine archetypes, the Queen, the Mother, the Wise Woman, and the Beloved. Now, last week we talked about their masculine principled counterparts, which are the King, the Warrior, the Magician, and the Lover. And so this week we're going to be discussing the feminine archetypes that correspond. Alright, so before we get into talking about these archetypes, let's talk a little bit about what archetypes are in general. So archetypes are basically like instinctual thought forms that exist in the unconscious mind. So I talked about in last week's video how Carl Jung came up with the idea of archetypes and saw it as an organ of the unconscious mind and as something that connects all of humanity to one another. Like all human beings have access to the collective unconscious, and in the same way that we all have a heart and we all have lungs, we all have a mother archetype, and we all have a queen archetype, we all have a wise woman archetype, we all have a beloved archetype within. So all of the archetypes exist there as organs of the collective unconscious that we have access to. And these archetypes have shown up in the artwork and the stories of all different cultures across all different eras. And I like to refer to archetypes as common skeletons of meaning, where it might come up very different in different cultures, but ultimately the same form is going to be there, the same structure is going to be there. And so that skeleton will be the same in every single culture, but it might be fleshed out in very different ways. So for example, we'll all have a conception of what the queen archetype looks like, but that's going to be different from culture to culture. But there's still going to be this element of personal sovereignty and being able to make wise decisions based off of your internal sense of knowing. And we can tap into the power of archetypes to assist our growth and development and individuation. So in the last video, I talked about how tapping into these archetypes can actually be a way for us to find hidden potentials within ourselves and develop those potentials. So to give a personal example of how I've used the power of archetypes to help develop myself, when I was a teenager around the age of 16, I had a chemistry teacher named Mr. Bingham who really embodied the warrior archetype. So the warrior archetype has this element of discipline and focus and the ability to overcome obstacles that stand in the way of our goals. And he used to have these great sayings that he would weave in with his regular instruction, where he would say things like, "Successful people do things well, especially when they don't want to." Now, it happened to be that at the time I had a job for the first time, that I worked most days of the week, and then I also had homework, in a lot of my classes that took many, many hours. Before, I could just kind of skate by in school. But this actually took me a long time to actually get done with what I needed to get done with. And so I would get home at 10:30 at night from work, and I would have to do the dishes, and then I would have to get started on my homework, and I'd usually have 2-3 hours of homework. And so I'd stay up into the wee hours of the night just saying, "Successful people do things well, especially when they don't want to. Successful people do things well, especially when they don't want to." And through that perseverance, I was able to develop this really, really strong work ethic, and I was able to achieve my goal of being able to keep my job while also getting straight A's in all of my classes. And this was a really formative time for my development of the warrior archetype. And because he was such a strong embodiment of that and certain facets of that archetype, I was able to really grow myself in that direction. It was because he was very tapped into the warrior archetype, and I was able to tap into it through him. And so we can connect to archetypes, through, let's say, people that we know from life who are role models. We can also connect to it through people who are, let's say, famous, and they don't have to even be alive anymore. It can be somebody from the past, who is from 500 years ago, and we can connect to a certain archetype through them. Or we can even connect to an archetype through a fictional character that we really, really admire. And so it's through this connection to other people or other characters who embody these archetypes, and being able to kind of almost step into the energy of that person or emulate that person in some way, that we can start to tap into these psychological organs that we have called archetypes, and to be able to tap into the wellspring of power and the potential for growth that's there. Now, it isn't all just people-based archetypes. So we have the king, we have the queen, we have the magician, we got the wise one, we have these are all people archetypes. But ultimately, we have archetypes that are places, and we also have archetypes that are objects, and then also just general dynamics that are common to humanity. So in terms of the people archetypes, we could have like the crone, or the healer, or the orphan. Or in terms of the place archetypes, we could have like the cave, or the village, or the desert. And in terms of the object-based archetypes, we could have the pen, the sword, and the crown. And in terms of, let's say, the dynamic-based archetypes, we could have things like falling in love, doing chores, and family feuds. And what makes all of these things archetypes is that they have a common instinctual meaning to all human beings across all eras and cultures. There could be some variations here and there, but fundamentally that skeleton of meaning remains the same. Now, in the last video that I did about the king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover, I took a lot of information from the book King, Warrior, Magician, Lover by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette. Now, in that book, they talk about, let's say, the kind of healthy version of the archetype, and they also talk about the unhealthy versions of the archetype. So let's say the king, for example, they had, let's say, said the polarization, the negative versions of the king would be like the weakling king and the tyrannical king. Now, there's no such equivalent book with the queen, the mother, the wise woman, and the beloved, but what I'm going to be doing is I'm basically going to be structuring this video the same way, where I talk about the healthy version of the archetype, and then I talk about the two unhealthy versions of the archetype, which are two polarities. One is an active polarity and one is a more passive polarity. So with the king archetype, the active one would be like the tyrannical king, and the passive one would be the weakling king. So I'm going to be doing that for each one of the feminine archetypes as well, and I'm also going to be talking about how you can integrate this archetype for yourself in its healthy version. Now, before we get into these archetypes, I wanted to just mention something really quick. Back in July, I started a membership site called the Consciousness Workers Club, and basically in the Consciousness Workers Club, I teach one monthly live class, and I conduct one monthly group coaching session. So if anybody has questions they want me to answer or get my 2 cents on, they can kind of hop on in the meetings if they're a member. There's also a community forum element to the Consciousness Workers Club, where let's say the members of the club can kind of interact with one another, and I also go on there and interact as well. And then with the classes and the group coaching sessions, all of those are recorded and kind of put in a catalog. So there's a kind of a growing catalog of exclusive content that you won't find anywhere on the channel. And so if that's something that you're interested in, enrollment is opening up very soon for that. So basically that will open up on Sunday, October 1st, which I think is next week from the perspective of when I'm releasing this video, up until Sunday, October 8th. So I only open enrollment once per season, and so that enrollment period is coming up very, very soon. And so if you want to get notifications for when enrollment is open, you can sign up on the waiting list, and I'm going to leave a link below in the description box and in the comments section. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into the Queen archetype. Now, I made a whole video about the Queen archetype a couple of years back, and so you can kind of check through my old content to check that out. But basically the Queen archetype has to do with personal sovereignty. So any sovereign archetype is going to have to do with sovereignty in some kind of way. So the King archetype has to do with sovereignty relative to external matters, whereas the Queen is more internal in her sovereignty. So while the King archetype is more focused toward things like, those in the distance, like foreign policy, the Queen is very, very much focused on the internal of the kingdom. So basically, the queen is associated with, like, let's say, all of the subjects in the kingdom and the relationship that the subjects have to one another, and if there are certain, let's say, interests within the kingdom. So let's say the example that I gave in the last video is, let's say if there's the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker, you need to make sure that those work together and don't run afoul of one another if you're the queen. So basically it's a very internal type of thing. There's also an element of being in touch with the subjective truth, being able to connect into one's own personal sovereignty and to say, I think this, I feel this, I experience things this way, I sense things this way. So the king is more focused on what's objectively true and being able to speak objective truth with conviction. To say something like, oh, the sky is blue, it's objectively true, and to be able to speak that with conviction without hedging oneself out. With the queen archetype, it's very much about like getting the sense of what your internal truth is. So your subjective perspective is everything that you see, hear, smell, touch, and taste, and it's all the thoughts that arise for you and all the emotions that arise for you. And to be able to see those things as valid and to be able to stay in your own center and to say, I see things this way, I experience things this way. And so the queen is really, really a strong deterrent from things like gaslighting, where people are saying you shouldn't feel the way that you feel, or you shouldn't be thinking the way that you're thinking. And ultimately, the queen has to do with maintaining this sense of personal sovereignty and a connection to our own subjective truth in relation to people who are close to us. So to be able to stay in the center of our own power around friends, around family, and around romantic partners. There's an element within the queen of like being able to be very internally attuned to oneself, but then also being able to attune to other people as well, and to kind of acknowledge one's own boundaries and to say, okay, these are my boundaries here, but also to recognize that everybody else is the queen of their own kingdom as well. And so it's being able to like kind of respect their sovereignty and to be able to respect their boundaries. And so basically being able to attune and have empathy internally by like connecting to our own emotional state and our own vulnerabilities and our own boundaries, and the same thing in terms of attuning and connecting to other people's emotions and vulnerabilities and boundaries. Now, in terms of the unhealthy form of the queen archetype, I came up with the polarities of the narcissistic queen, which is the more active negative polarity of the queen archetype, and the codependent queen, which is the more passive negative form of the queen archetype. So with the codependent queen is one that is out of her own center. So she's not able to connect to her personal sovereignty and doesn't see her emotions, feelings, and experiences as valid. And so she gives up her own throne and puts her subjects on the throne instead. So it's instead of making a decision internally and saying, what do I think? What do I want? What do I need? What do I feel? The codependent queen is one that feels that that's not a valid source of wisdom and cuts herself off from that personal center. And instead looks to other people who seem to have more of a sense of authority and puts them on her throne instead. And so let's say if there's a codependent queen who always kind of outsources her sovereignty to a friend of hers or to her mom or to another person or to some expert and says, oh, I can't trust my internal guidance as something valid, so I have to listen to this other person. And basically she marginalizes herself to the peripheries of her own subjective experiences and centers somebody else. And so instead of standing in one's own power, it's like abdicating that power, hiding from the throne. And the codependent queen attunes to others, but does not attune to herself. So the codependent queen will often be unsure of what her vulnerabilities are, what her needs are, what her boundaries are. So not only does she not advocate for those things, she might not even be aware of that. She's so much attuned to how other people are feeling and how other people are thinking of her and how other people are doing that she loses sight of her own internal compass. Now the narcissistic queen, on the other hand, is one that only attunes to oneself but does not attune to others. And so she has really, really firm boundaries and even walls when it comes to her own self. And she's always doing things to benefit herself. But then when it comes to other people, it's like they're just pawns in her own game. She doesn't really see them as having feelings or anything valid that she needs to attune to. It's basically like she doesn't mind whose boundaries she has to cross in order to benefit herself. And she doesn't even just see herself as possessing her own personal sovereignty and being the queen of her own internal world. She feels like she has to be the queen, the one that's in control of other people's internal worlds. And so she tries to manipulate people into thinking the way that she thinks and feeling the way that she feels. And she rules with an iron fist, and she understands her position of leadership as being one that's meant to benefit her, and it's not in any way about being a public servant to others. And she specifically looks to surround herself by other codependent queens who are afraid of their own authority, so that she can grandstand as the authority that they then attune to. Now, in order to integrate the healthy queen archetype, we have to attune to our own emotions, our own feelings, and our own sense of personal sovereignty. And we have to become aware of where our boundaries are and be willing to enforce those boundaries. We also need to recognize the value of subjective truth. If we only recognize the value of objective truth, we will be out of touch with the healthy queen archetype. And so we have to recognize the value and the validity of our own subjective truth and the subjective truths of others. And to recognize that our perspective is all that we have. It's our only anchor point within truth. And so to be able to find that center within ourselves, we have to recognize that what we experience is valid, what we feel is valid, how we take in the world is valid, how we interpret things is valid. It doesn't mean it's absolutely true, but what it does mean is that it's a valid perspective for us to hold. We also need to be able to attune ourselves to the feelings of other people and attune ourselves to the boundaries of other people. Now, we want to make sure that we don't do this at the expense of attuning to our own feelings and our own boundaries, but we want to equalize things in a way where we can recognize and enforce our own boundaries, and we can recognize other people's boundaries and respect them as well. There's also an element of reconciliation with the queen archetype, where let's say if there's a certain agenda clash between ourselves and our family members, or ourselves and our romantic partners, or ourselves and our friends, that we're able to create a way to reconcile things and create as much of a win-win as possible. It's also important to cultivate the ability to stay in one's own center, even when confronted and challenged by people who are posing as authority figures. So, for example, like let's say if we take the movie The Wizard of Oz, when the wizard is kind of grandstanding as this like big green floating head with absolute power, and he challenges Dorothy, Dorothy still stays firmly in her own power and pushes back on the wizard's bad behavior when he doesn't agree to follow through with his promises. And with the queen archetype, it's very important for us to protect our own energy and to protect our own vulnerability by being able to set firm boundaries. All right, so moving on now to the mother archetype. Now, the mother archetype is the feminine counterpart to the warrior archetype. And the way that these two archetypes relate together is that both are related to a type of protection. The warrior protects by like kind of going out and like fighting an enemy and creating a protective barrier. Now, the mother protects by creating a nurturing, safe space for something to grow. In the case of like a literal motherhood, it's like a child gets to grow in this safe space. So we create a safe space and a nurturing environment for the child to grow so that the world doesn't kind of press in at them and get in the way of their growth and development and their thriving. Now, the warrior is one that creates a more impersonal boundary that kind of pushes back attackers, so it's less about creating a nurturing safe space and more like creating a protective boundary. So there's the ability to create a safe and nurturing space for a child, or perhaps it's for another person, or we could even say that we're creating a safe and nurturing space so that we can like grow a certain idea. So maybe it's the case that we have a great idea for some business that we want to start, but we know that the people around us would tend to poo-poo that idea, and so what we do is we kind of of keep that to ourselves. We keep it there until it's grown enough to where it can handle that onslaught. Or maybe we're cultivating a garden. And we know that, let's say, when the plants are just sprouts, they can be easily crushed. And so we create this containment around it so that it can continue to grow, so that, the world doesn't press in on it. We can even relate this to kind of nurturing ourselves, so if we're in a vulnerable place or we need to protect our energy in some way, in connecting with the mother archetype, we can start to create that for ourselves. And we can create a nice home environment where we can feel nice and comfortable. And sustenance also comes into play with the mother archetype. So it's all the things that we do every day to sustain our life, so being able to sustain our life means like being able to eat healthy food and to drink lots of water and to get enough rest and to do little things that maybe don't seem like much but really add up to a lot in terms of our quality of life. And there's also a strong association between the mother archetype and the planet. So our relationship to the mother archetype and our relationship to Earth are really one and the same. And if we don't have such a good relationship to the mother archetype, we might have a difficult relationship with things like our own bodies, which come from the Earth. And the mother archetype in its highest analog is Mother Nature herself. And so this is why we have an association between the words mother and matter. So matter, maternal, matrix, all of these things, relate together with the idea that the three-dimensional world is associated with the mother. And if we're disconnected from the mother, oftentimes we'll feel ungrounded. We'll feel disconnected from the world around us. We'll feel like a stranger in a strange land on this planet. Now, the two negative polarities that I chose for the mother archetype in its active form is the smothering mother, and in its passive form is the neglectful mother. So the smothering mother is like the helicopter parent that wants control over everything their child does and wants to know everything that's going on with their child. It's the one that doesn't let go, the one that wants to cling very tightly onto the role of mother and thus infantilizes her children so that they stay dependent and relying on her so that they don't leave and change her identity. It's also the mother that squelches her child's development and clips their wings for fear of what will happen to the child, not for the sake of the child, but for the sake of, oh gosh, how am I going to feel if my child is hurt? And in more extreme cases, this archetype can become enraged and even physically abusive toward her children if they don't match up to her expectations of how they should act in her eyes. The neglectful mother, on the other hand, sort of is one that resents the role of mother, that basically creates distance between her and her children and doesn't nurture or care for them. She expects the children to rely on themselves and themselves only. And in extreme cases, maybe she doesn't even feed her children. I would associate the smothering mother with a more anxious attachment to the children, whereas the neglectful mother has a more avoidant attachment to her children. Now, again, this doesn't have to necessarily relate to motherhood specifically. So we could be, somebody who's not a parent at all, but in how we, let's say, nurture other people and like the dynamics that come up there, we can see these two negative polarities come about. Now, in terms of how to develop our connection to the mother archetype, one of the things we want to do is we want to, kind of connect to our ability to nurture others and to nurture ourselves and also to nurture anything that's in our care. We also want to come to attune to and value vulnerability and to be able to create safe spaces so that vulnerability can exist without having to hide away. There's also a strong element of creativity that's associated with the mother archetype. So being able to develop our ability to bring something into manifestation, be able to create something. So an artist that creates something is tapping into the creative power of the mother archetype. Also, if we want to connect to the mother archetype, we want to get more in touch with our body and more in touch with the earth and the physical world in general. So if we're somebody who tends to stay way up in our heads, heads, we can tend to be out of touch with the mother archetype. And so we want to start, getting back down into our connection to the body and to our instincts and to our connection to the planet. We also want to be grateful for and to honor the 3D world and all of the things that it has to give us. So being appreciative of the food that Mother Earth grows, being appreciative of all the experiences that being on this platform makes possible. We also want to make sure that we don't identify with the mother too strongly. So in the situations where we're mothering someone or something, we want to hold on to that identity very loosely and be willing to let it go, because when we can let go of that identity, we can also allow our children or, whatever else it is that we're nurturing to have a life of its own. Along these same lines, we also want to be able to give unconditionally without expectation of receiving. So we want to be very, very mindful if we're thinking, oh, I'm going to give all of this to my children, I'm going to nurture my children this way, and then they owe me. Or, oh, let me nurture this person, but afterward, then they have to give me this. So if we find ourselves in that pattern, which we can be doing so unconsciously, we want to let go of the idea that we're ever going to get anything in return for what it is that we give. Even things like appreciation, we should not even expect that when it comes to things like sustenance. And this might be something that genuinely drives a lot of mothers nuts. It's like they clean the house, they don't get, appreciation for it, or, they make dinner and they don't get appreciation for it. And so you have to find some kind of internal kind of motivation for doing those things, because oftentimes to be nurtured and to be, let's say if the mother is doing the sustaining jobs well, it tends to be very, very invisible work. And so we have to find our fulfillment in other things other than being the mother. We also want to be able to, along the lines of nurturing ourselves, we want to build habits that sustain us. We want to be able to do things like, like cooking good food and like maintaining the house. And we want to, let's say, be building that nice, comfortable space. And we want to be very personally motivated by that. We do that because we want to benefit from it, not because we're trying to benefit someone else. But the side effect is that it will benefit other people as well. All right, so that's it for the mother archetype. And next we're going to be talking about the wise woman archetype. Now, the masculine counterpart to the wise woman archetype is the magician archetype. The magician is the one that is attuned to the external world and knows secret knowledge about the external world, whereas the wise woman is more oriented toward the internal world. So she's very, very introspective, very, very connected to the intuition, very connected to the subconscious mind. And so the wise woman is very attuned to her own internal world, and because she's so attuned to her own internal world, she can understand the inner worlds of other people. So while the magician is very attuned to things like academic pursuits and technology and science, the wise woman is very, very attuned to the wisdom of the depths. And this archetype is associated with psychic forces in general, as well as the wisdom of the body, and she is often depicted as an old crone. And so on my channel, I talk a lot about topics that relate to the wise woman archetype. And so shadow work is a perfect example of the wise woman archetype in action, because we're attuning to our internal psychic world so that we connect to parts of ourself that have been relegated to the unconscious. Now, the wise woman's form of knowing isn't empirically observable, and it isn't external, and it isn't something that you can learn about in a book or in an academic institution. It's something that is purely that of the internal world. And so there tends to be a lot of doubt cast on the wise woman's knowledge. And the wise woman's wisdom is not one that can be observed empirically, and it can't be studied by science, and it can't really be learned from books, though we can learn certain things that help us get more in touch with the wise woman wisdom within ourselves. But ultimately, because of this invisible, intangible nature of the wise woman's wisdom, oftentimes a lot of doubt and shade is cast cast upon it. So it isn't quite as respected in society as the magician's academic and scientific knowledge, but it's still a deep source of wisdom that's important for all of us to connect into. The wise woman is very aware of what makes people tick and sees the patterns of the human psyche and the human heart. So while the magician is associated with having a breadth of knowledge about the external world, the wise woman is associated with having a depth of wisdom about the internal world. But both the wise woman and the magician are associated with liminal space. So while the magician is associated with the liminal space between the society and the wilderness and the society and, let's say, the higher spiritual realms, what the wise woman is associated with is also the wilderness, just like the magician, and creating, like, let's say, kind of straddling between the society and the wilderness. She also is associated with the depths, so things like the unconscious. So ultimately, the magician and the wise woman are really, really close together on this one, very much two sides to one coin. Now, in terms of the unhealthy manifestations of the wise woman archetype, we have on the more active end, we have the delusional self-contained wise woman, and then on the other more passive end, we have the intuitively blunted wise woman. So the delusional self-contained wise woman is the form of the wise woman where she gets so sucked into the internal world that she loses connection to objective reality. So she doesn't connect into the consensus reality where everybody else exists, but becomes very, very self-contained in her own internal world and starts to kind of even mix up the different, mix up logos and mythos. So ultimately a big part of connecting to the wise woman is to be in touch with mythos, to like kind of get in touch with something that's not such a logical and linear way of going about things. But when we polarize so heavily into mythos to the exclusion of logos, what happens is that we start to devolve into a kind of magical thinking that disconnects us from, like, let's say, the practical realities of life. And so somebody who is possessed by the delusional self-contained wise woman can be one that kind of shuts herself away and that just kind of spends her life kind of maladaptive daydreaming away. And she can even start to entertain truly delusional thoughts that really don't reconcile or connect with anything in reality. Now, the more passive negative polarity of the wise woman archetype is the intuitively blunted wise woman. So this is the wise woman that's so focused toward the external world that she can't really access the wisdom of her internal world. So she gets disconnected from her intuition, disconnected from her unconscious. Maybe she starts to even make all of her decisions using something like pros and cons or using logic to make every decision, or just getting so focused on the logistics of things that she can't connect more into her imaginal realm. And oftentimes the person who is disconnected from the wise woman, the healthy wise woman in this way, will get kind of blown off course because they'll have to make, basically all of their decisions based off of if this then that, like kind of logic statements. And ultimately that doesn't give us that gut feeling that we have when we're really truly going in the direction we want to be going in. So if you want to connect to the healthy wise woman archetype, one of the most important things you can do is to get into connection with your intuition, your gut reactions, your instincts, and basically just the wisdom of the body altogether. And you want to recognize and trust your emotions as carriers of genuine wisdom. Now that doesn't mean that when an emotion comes up that we need to react right away, or that every reaction that we take from an emotion is valid and valuable. But ultimately, the emotions coming up themselves is the way that the body communicates to us. And so if we can decipher the message that the body is trying to send to us through our emotions, ultimately, this gives us a lot more knowledge about ourselves and a lot more wisdom about how to go about whichever situation we're facing with. Also, in order to develop the wise woman archetype, you want to start getting very mindful of your own psychological and emotional patterns and your own behavioral patterns, and you want to start kind of getting a sense of what your deeper motivations are and kind of understanding why you're doing the things you're doing and why these patterns arise. And then once you do that with yourself, you can even start to notice this in other people, and you start to be able to cross-reference your awareness of these different patterns between yourself and others. And through that, you get more and more wisdom and more insight about the nature of the human psyche, about the nature of human emotions, and about, like, let's say, kind of those more like salt of the earth kind of like understandings of how life is in general. We'll also want to be able to differentiate between knowledge and wisdom in order to get in touch with the wise woman archetype. So knowledge is more external. They're things that we learn from books, they're things that we learn from teachers, they're things that we learn from the external world. Wisdom, on the other hand, comes from the inside. So it's like whenever we take in an experience or whenever we take in knowledge from the outside, there's sort of an internal process that comes up, and it's sort of the emotions, the feelings, and the insights just sort of arise from there. And so it's that internal sense of wisdom that we're really tapping into with the wise woman archetype. We also want to be able to hold space for uncertainty and not knowing. So the more we hold on to a sense of knowing, the more blunted we become from being open to wisdom flowing in. So we want to empty our cup of knowledge and recognize that we don't know anything beyond a shadow of a doubt, and that way wisdom flows into the cup freely. You also want to practice getting your own ego out of the way in order to tap into the wisdom of the depths. There are many things that we can find in the depths of our own psyche that we might feel very uncomfortable with facing with. So we might conceptualize of ourselves as being a good person, and we have a certain idea of what that means. And if we see something, let's say in our psyche, in our internal experience, that seems to go against that identity, we might have a tendency to want to block it out, but we want to be able to allow ourselves to experience that and to be aware of that. And it's through that awareness that we're able to cultivate wisdom. You'll also want to make sure that you're not trying to figure out insights. Basically, insights just flow to you. So you want to just be able to kind of step out of the way, let those insights flow, and then trust them as they come up. You'll also want to hold space for all opposite polarities within the personality. So if we can hold space for one thing and its opposite, it allows everything to be there. And this is where we have the best chance of wisdom flowing to us. And perhaps most importantly, we want to be able to develop a kind of comfort with looking at darker things, things about ourselves that might make us uncomfortable, or even looking at the darker things about humanity in general or existence in general that might create a kind of aversion. And it's in being able to look at and accept the darker side of things that we get a lot of insights, that we get a lot of connection to the wise woman archetype. All right, so that's it for the wise woman archetype, and now moving on to the beloved archetype, which is the last of the 4 feminine archetypes we'll be talking about in this video. Now, what I will say before this is that people tend to have the biggest issue integrating the beloved archetype. It tends to be the one that people find most difficult, and that's because the beloved has to do with being. In fact, it's interesting that beloved even has the word be right in the front of the word, and so basically, with the beloved, it's not about doing anything to get love. It's about being loved just for who you are, being loved just because you exist. So the masculine counterpart to this archetype is the lover archetype. The lover archetype is one that gives love unconditionally, while the beloved is the one that receives love unconditionally. And so the beloved is inherently precious, and so the lover is the one that does and acts and gives, while the beloved simply is and just is the recipient of that. And there is no particular reason for the beloved to be the beloved. The beloved isn't the beloved because she's smart or because she's beautiful or because she does really cool, ambitious things. It's just because she is. And so this is what tends to be difficult for people to really connect to, and ultimately to realize the beloved is the antidote to shame. And so when a person has shame, oftentimes they'll polarize themselves over into the lover, and they'll keep trying to give and achieve and self-improve and become better and better and better. And it's in order to resolve shame, but you can't resolve shame through the lover archetype. You can only resolve shame through the beloved archetype, to realize that you are inherently okay just as you are, that you belong here simply because you are here, that there is nothing that you have to do to earn your keep here. so that you are unconditionally lovable just exactly the way that you are. And so that's the challenge of connecting to the beloved archetype. It's like, how do you realize that you're already valid when you don't feel valid? So it's kind of similar to, just to make another Wizard of Oz reference, which by the way is really great if you want a feminine hero myth. Basically, it's like a heroine's journey. But basically with Dorothy, she spends the whole time trying to go home, and she's going through, like hill and high water, like trying to get home. Where's home? Where's home? Where's home? But the reality is that she's just an illusion, that she's not home. She's been home the whole entire time. All she has to do is click her heels together to realize. And that's sort of the way it is for the beloved. The beloved is already there. The beloved is already in a state of being unconditionally loved, just as every single one of us are. Everything simply is, and if we can realize that there's an inherent validity to that, we can connect to the beloved archetype. But oftentimes shame stands in the way of that. And there's all sorts of illusions that give us the sense that we're not valid unless we're doing this, or unless we're achieving that, or unless we look this way or we act this way. So it's like, can we click our heels together like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz and just realize that we are already enough as we are? We are already okay as we are. And ultimately, connecting to the beloved archetype is actually a prerequisite for developing the Queen archetype. So the Queen archetype has a lot to do with connecting to our own personal sovereignty and our own subjective truth. Until we develop our connection to the beloved, we will see our personal sovereignty as invalid, and we will see our personal truth as unworthy. Whereas when we recognize as the beloved that our subjective truth is valid and valuable, and that the way that we experience things matters, then we start to be able to see our personal sovereignty as a valid source of wisdom that comes from the inside. And so when we connect to the beloved archetype, this enables us to embody the personal sovereignty of the Queen. So if we are in a state where we're disconnected from the beloved and we feel like we have to earn our place here, that we have to earn love, that we have to impress other people, that we have to do certain things to be valid and valuable, well, ultimately that's the illusion. And the difficulty here is that the further you go into that illusion, the more it's going to feel like you're getting closer to earning the love, but then you'll be getting further and further apart. The more requirements you're placing upon yourself to regard yourself as valid and valuable and lovable, the more you do that, the further and further you get away from the beloved. So the only way to get in touch with the beloved is to not try, is to not do, is to simply allow yourself to be and to recognize the validity of that being. Now that doesn't mean that you can't do things from other motivational standpoints. It's like, okay, I gotta get up and I gotta go to work and I gotta do all these other things. But the main thing is, don't do those things to try to earn respect, love, validity, any of these things. Again, the beloved receives unconditionally, and the beloved doesn't need to do anything to win the lover's affections. So the beloved is already lovable as it is. The beloved simply has value simply for being. And at the highest analog of this archetype of the lover and beloved, and I mentioned this in the last video, is the lover is like God, that loves and gives love unconditionally, that creates all of creation just for you. And so we, individually are each the lover in that situation. We receive all of these things, from the Creator, and we interact with the creation, and we are the creation. And so this dynamic between the Creator and the creation is a higher analog of the lover and beloved archetype as it's realized in an earthly sense. And I kind of like to think about the lover and beloved dynamic on this level as the relationship between God and Eve. Now, in terms of the negative polarization of the beloved archetype, I came up with the devouring beloved as the more active negative form of the archetype, and the starved beloved as the more passive form of the archetype. And so with the devouring beloved is the one who is constantly looking for other people's love, energy, and attention. She's always looking to kind of take from people. So she kind of acts like the most negative form of like a diva, always wanting to be the center of attention, always wanting to be the star of the show, and always kind of like relying heavily on the adoration of others, you know, and let's say for others to kind of fill her up. And she always needs there to be many lovers to be in relation to her. And I don't just mean this in a romantic sense. She needs other people to be constantly showering her with praise and attention. Now, ultimately, the devouring beloved and the starved beloved are one and the same, because the devouring beloved acts this way because she is a starved beloved. She doesn't feel the sense of inherent worth, and she's always needing some kind of validation from the outside. She's always needing for people to give her all their energy and all of their attention and all of their praise. Now, the starved beloved, on the other hand, is the one that doesn't feel worthy as she is. You know, is the one that says, ooh, I don't belong here. I need to earn my keep here. What can I do? What can I achieve in order to earn my place here in the universe? Oh, I know, maybe I can be extra beautiful and then I'll belong here. Or, oh, maybe I'll achieve this thing or that thing and then my life will have meaning and be valid. Or maybe I can try to do something really, really well. And if I do something well enough, I can earn some praise from others, and that will like fill up some of that void, you know, some of that sense of not being the beloved. And so the starved beloved gets in this hamster wheel of trying to self-improve and trying to achieve and trying to get better and better and better, because she doesn't feel okay as she is. She feels shame, an inherent sense of shame, and feels down here, feels like she can't connect into, you know, what other people are able to connect into, feels automatically like other people are superior. And so she has to find some way of, let's say, creating an identity where she can be superior by trying to earn it and achieve it in some kind of way. And so the starved beloved is one that in some ways can look like a lot of success from the perspective of the warrior, and oftentimes is a lot of success from the perspective of the warrior archetype, but the beloved is still very, very starved in this way. And so ultimately, you know, the way that we can reconcile this, you know, is to be able to realize our own value on the level of being, where we don't need a lover to validate our lovability in order to be the beloved, and we don't need to achieve something or earn our keep in some way. So if you want to develop the healthy form of the beloved archetype, the number one thing you have to do is to love yourself unconditionally and accept yourself exactly as you are. It's also important to recognize the beauty in yourself just as you are. So recognize the beauty of your life, recognize the beauty of your flaws, recognize, you know, even if you've experienced negative things, recognize the beauty in the pains and the joys that you've experienced. Recognize beauty in unconventional ways. You'll also want to recognize that you are inherently worthy of love and existence regardless of what you do and what you don't do, and that other people are also like worthy of love and existence exactly as they are as well. So the beloved is very much lateral. So anytime hierarchy comes into play with the beloved archetype, we've automatically like distorted the archetype and created shame. With the beloved archetype, everything is very lateral. That means that no person is worth more or less than another person. It's not about like achieving or standing out from the competition or anything like that. It's not a race. It's not a competition. Ultimately, everything is exactly shoulder to shoulder and eye to eye. There is no distinction between one person or another, even on the basis of things like ethics, even on the basis of things like achievement. You know, nothing is going to make us any more or less valuable than we already are. But the good news is that we're all already infinitely valuable, so much more valuable than what our minds can comprehend. Also, to connect with the beloved archetype, it's important to recognize the unshakable validity of your own being. You know, it is fascinating that you're even here in the first place. So many things had to happen a very specific way for you to be exactly where you are now. And oftentimes there can be this shaky sense of, oh, do I belong here? Am I really connected here? What if I'm a mistake? All of these things. Ultimately, being able to recognize in a very visceral way the unshakable validity of your being is a great way to connect with the beloved archetype. Also, one of the things that's really important in connecting to the beloved archetype is realizing that the lover doesn't make the beloved the beloved. The lover comes, and that's like, you know, that kind of is a dynamic that can come about between those archetypes. But you don't need a lover to be a beloved. You can simply be a beloved because you are. You know, so your value doesn't go away just because other people fail to recognize it. Another thing is to recognize the beauty and preciousness of your physicality and your personality. And again, looking at things that you might typically see as flaws. The challenge is, can you recognize them as beautiful? Also, when you're the beloved, you want to treat yourself like the beloved. So you want to be able to wear the type of clothing that you want to wear. You want to give yourself the good life. You want to give yourself good food. You want to basically really take care of yourself and to treat yourself like a beloved. So you can be the lover to your own beloved in that way. And another thing is to develop receptivity and gratitude for what you've been given. So the universe is always giving to you unconditionally. All of the experiences that you've had in your life have essentially been gifts from the lover to you, the beloved. And so can you recognize how everything has been a gift? Even things that don't look like gifts. Now, one of the things that's like come up for me that I can feel very strongly is like all of the different relationships that I've had in my life. Those relationships have been a huge gift, and I didn't have to earn them in some kind of way. I didn't have to pay the universe to produce that for me, but reality just gave me those gifts just as it is. And so being able to develop gratitude and then also to be able to be more receptive and to develop unconditional receptivity where you receive everything that life has to offer you. And finally, what I recommend is I would not use the word deserving ever again, because there's really no such thing as deserving. So the idea of deserving oftentimes keeps people away from connecting to their beloved archetype. So if it's this sense of, oh, I don't deserve this, oh no, like, you know, it's such a nice thing to have, but I don't deserve it, I haven't earned it. You know, this notion is something that we human beings make up in our minds. It's not really real. So I would just totally get rid of the notion of deserving altogether. All right, so that's it for the feminine archetypes. If you haven't checked out the masculine principled archetypes video that I made last week, go ahead and do that now. You know, I highly recommend it. But anyway, that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button below and subscribe. Also, if you would like to get on the waiting list for the Consciousness Workers Club, I'll leave a link down below in the description and in the comments section. You know, I'd be very excited to have you in the club. And anyway, that's all I have for you for now. And until next time, keep becoming more you.